The cowboy waited for his mail-order bride, but an armed outlaw woman took her place. Arizona Territory, July 1887. The sun was a hammer, and the dust was a shroud over the tiny town of Redemption. Sheriff Daniel Clay stood on the lonely train platform, the wood baking under his polished boots. He'd shined them twice. He'd fixed his hat just so. He was a man who'd known nothing but the vast, crushing silence of the desert, and the letters in his coat pocket were a promise of an end to that silence. Her name was Sarah. Her words spoke of kindness, of a new beginning. For months, he had pictured her stepping off that train, a gentle woman with a shy smile. The train whistle screamed, a long, mournful cry that ripped through the afternoon heat. Iron wheels groaned as they slowed to a stop, and destiny played its cruelest joke. It wasn't Sarah who stepped down from the train. It was a tall woman in a black duster, her eyes as hard and cold as river stones. Her movements were sharp, precise. Beneath her coat, hidden but certain, was the heavy weight of a Colt revolver. It was a weight that promised to change everything. The train smoke billowed, a gray ghost against a merciless blue sky. Daniel's eyes locked on the stranger. Her hand hovered near her hip, a silent threat. And in that one, heart-stopping instant, every dream the sheriff had carefully built, the polished boots, the quiet porch, the tender words in the letters, crumbled into dust. The loneliness he thought he was escaping came rushing back, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. But as his hope shattered, he remembered the nights. The long, dark nights in his cabin where the silence wasn't just quiet, it was a living thing that echoed his own emptiness. He had stared out at the endless horizon and prayed for someone, anyone, to share the burden. That desperate hunger had been his anchor. It had made him believe a woman's words on paper could stitch his soul back together. Now, standing before him was not a healer. She was a storm carved from shadow and steel. Fear should have been the first thing he felt. A cold, sensible fear that told him to draw his weapon. But it wasn't fear that rooted him to the spot. It was something else. A strange, magnetic pull. In her fierce gaze, he saw not just danger, but a deep, familiar ache. It was as if fate had heard his prayer and answered with a cruel, twisted test. The wind picked up, carrying the whispers of the townsfolk who had gathered to see the new bride. Their murmurs were a rising tide of suspicion and fear. Daniel's hands, usually so steady, trembled. Not with fear of a bullet, but with the terrifying knowledge that his future had just been violently rewritten by a force he could neither control nor comprehend. He thought of the home he had prepared, the meals he had planned, the letters he kept folded under his pillow. Each memory was a fresh cut. He had wanted a partner to heal the silence. The world had sent him a warrior forged in fire. But then he saw it. Just for a second. Behind the steel in her eyes, a flicker of profound sorrow. A glimpse of a soul, not just sharpened by violence, but chased by its own relentless ghosts. And in that instant, Daniel knew his hope wasn't dead. It had just been transformed into something darker, heavier, and terrifyingly alive. The path ahead was no longer one of quiet love, but of blood, betrayal, and choices that would tear him apart. His search for belonging hadn't ended in disappointment. It had just begun. The woman's boot struck the wooden planks with a sharp, deliberate rhythm, a drumbeat of warning. She stopped just a few feet from him, close enough that he could see the faint, silvery trace of a scar near her temple. She knew his name. She said it, not with the warmth he'd read in the letters, but with the sharp edge of a blade. Daniel Clay. His hand went to his holster on pure instinct. The entire town held its breath. Before he could answer, she shifted her duster. Just an inch. But it was enough. The sunlight caught the polished steel of the revolver strapped to her hip. She wasn't just armed. She was a gunslinger. Her stance was that of someone who had faced death and walked away, again and again. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The whispers turned to shouts of recognition. This wasn't just some armed stranger. This was a face from a wanted poster. A name spoken with fear in saloons across 3 territories. Madeline Kane, the black vulture of the canyons. They said she'd robbed a dozen banks, that she'd left a trail of bodies from here to the border. Daniel had seen the poster himself. He'd tacked it to his office wall. And now, the legend was standing in front of him, claiming the place of the woman he was supposed to marry. But the gun, the name, the legend, none of it was what truly chilled him to the bone. It was the way she looked at him. Not like a lawman to be feared or a stranger to be sized up. She looked at him like he was the very reason she had come. Her eyes held a message far deadlier than any bullet. A message that said the past was a debt, and she was here to collect. The townsfolk scrambled backward, a wave of fear clearing the platform. Mothers clutched their children. Men who'd boasted of their toughness now looked for cover. The world shrank until it was just the 2 of them, trapped in the crosshairs of a story he didn't understand. Daniel's hand was frozen over the grip of his gun. Every part of him screamed that this was a threat, a danger to his town, his life. But something in the slight tremble of her breath held him back. Behind the mask of the infamous outlaw, he saw a sliver of raw, desperate pain. A wound so deep that no bounty could ever measure it. He found himself fighting a war on 2 fronts. The duty to protect his town, and the overwhelming illogical urge to understand the curse that had tied her destiny to his. She spoke again, her voice still sharp, but now it was cracked with a sorrow that cut through the heat. "I didn't come here to get married, Sheriff," she said, her eyes boring into his. "I came to deliver justice." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of war. And in that moment, the line between Daniel's duty and his heart blurred into nothing. Whatever choice he made next would not just decide if he lived or died, it would decide if he was willing to betray everything he'd ever stood for. "Where is Sarah?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a dry rasp. Madeline Kane's expression shifted. The hardness faltered, replaced by a flicker of something that looked like pity. She reached into her duster, not for her gun, but for a worn leather satchel. She tossed it onto the dusty platform between them. It landed with a soft thud. "Sarah isn't coming," Madeline said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's dead." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Dead. The woman whose letters had been his only comfort, his only hope. Gone. "How?" he asked, the world tilting on its axis. "She was my sister," Madeline said, and the confession shattered the air. The infamous outlaw, the Black Vulture, had a sister who wrote letters of love to a lonely sheriff. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. "She was on a stagecoach to meet you. It was stopped. Robbed. They killed her for the locket around her neck." She looked up, and now her eyes weren't just cold, they were burning with a righteous fire. "The men who did it? They rode here. To redemption." Suddenly, the wanted posters, the reputation, the gun on her hip, it all snapped into a terrifying new focus. She wasn't a common criminal. She was a woman on a mission of vengeance. A mission that had led her straight to his town, to his platform, to him. "I took her place on this train," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I used her ticket. I needed to get into this town without raising alarm. I needed to find them before they disappeared forever." She took a step closer. The fear from the townsfolk was now mixed with a stunned, morbid curiosity. "The man who leads them," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss, "is a man this town respects. A man they call a founder. A man you probably call a friend." A cold dread crept up Daniel's spine. He thought of the town's council, the ranchers, the businessmen, men he shared drinks with, men he trusted. "Who?" he demanded. Madeline's eyes flickered past him, toward the town's main street. toward the largest, most prosperous building in Redemption, the Blackstone Mercantile. His name is Judge Harold Blackstone. The name was impossible. Judge Blackstone wasn't just a friend, he was the law in this part of the territory. He was the one who signed the warrants, the one who funded the sheriff's office. He was untouchable. "You're lying," Daniel said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "Am I?" she shot back. "My sister described the locket in her last letter to me. Silver, with a bluebird etched on the front. I saw his wife, Martha, wearing it in the market not an hour after I arrived." It was a lie. It had to be. But the conviction in her voice was absolute. She was either the best liar in the territory, or she was telling a truth so monstrous it could tear the town apart. His world was unraveling, thread by painful thread. His bride was dead. Her sister was an infamous outlaw. And the man he served, the symbol of justice in Redemption, was a murderer. His hand fell away from his gun. What was he supposed to do? Arrest the woman who came seeking justice, or confront the man who held all the power? Before he could decide, a new sound cut through the tense silence. Hoofbeats, fast, at least a half-dozen riders, coming in hard from the east. Madeline's head snapped toward the sound, her hand instantly finding the grip of her Colt. "They found me," she whispered, a new, desperate edge to her voice. "Bounty hunters." The riders crested the rise, a cloud of dust billowing behind them. They weren't ragtag bounty hunters. They were organized, disciplined. They wore matching vests. They were Pinkertons. And at their head rode a man with a face like a hawk and eyes that missed nothing. Agent Elias Finch. His reputation was even more fearsome than Madeline's. He was known for bringing in his targets dead or alive, and he had a strong preference for the former. Finch brought his posse to a halt, his cold eyes sweeping over the scene, the terrified townsfolk, the sheriff, and the outlaw. He dismounted, his movements economical and deadly. "Sheriff Clay," Finch said, his voice like gravel. "I'm here on behalf of the United States government. We're tracking a fugitive, Madeline Kane." He pointed a gloved finger at her. "Wanted for the murder of a federal official in Santa Fe. Murder. Not robbery. Murder of a federal official." The stakes had just been raised to a level Daniel couldn't even comprehend. "That's a lie!" Madeline yelled, her gaze fixed on Finch. "He was corrupt! He worked for Blackstone!" Finch ignored her, his eyes locked on Daniel. "She is to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. I have a warrant for her arrest. You will stand down and let my men take her into custody." It was a command, not a request. Daniel was trapped. On one side, a woman with a wild, unbelievable story of vengeance. On the other, a federal agent with a warrant and 6 rifles backing him up. The law was clear. His duty was to hand her over. But then he looked at Madeline. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he'd read in her sister's letters. A fire for justice. He saw the scar on her temple and the haunted look of someone who had lost everything. He thought of Blackstone, of his power, his influence, of the casual way he dismissed the struggles of others. He thought of the locket. Agent Finch took a step forward. "Sheriff, your decision." The whole world waited. His town, his career, his life. All of it hung on this single moment. He could follow the law, hand her over, and return to his quiet, empty life. Or he could stand with a killer, a liar, a ghost, and risk everything for a truth he wasn't even sure he believed. He took a slow, deliberate step to the side. A small movement that changed everything. He was no longer standing in front of Madeline Kane. He was standing beside her. "She's not going anywhere, Finch," Daniel said, and his own voice sounded strange to him. It was the voice of a man he didn't know. "Not until I get some answers." Finch's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "You're making a grave mistake, Sheriff. That's obstruction of justice." "Then I guess you'll have to arrest me too," Daniel replied, his hand now resting firmly on the grip of his gun. For a heart-stopping second, nobody moved. The Pinkertons gripped their rifles, their knuckles white. The townsfolk were frozen in a state of shock. The Sheriff of Redemption had just drawn a line in the sand, siding with a wanted murderer against federal agents. Madeline stared at him, her hardened mask cracking with disbelief. No one had ever stood for her. Not once. Finch let out a short, humorless laugh. "So be it." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. The world exploded in a symphony of chaos. Gunfire erupted from the Pinkertons' rifles, splintering the wooden platform. Daniel reacted on pure instinct, shoving Madeline to the ground and drawing his own revolver in a single fluid motion. He fired back, not aiming to kill, but to provide cover. "The alley!" he yelled over the deafening roar of the guns. "Now!" They scrambled behind a stack of crates as bullets chewed through the air around them. The townsfolk screamed and scattered, running for their lives. This wasn't a standoff anymore. It was a war zone. "Why?" Madeline shouted, reloading her own Colt with practiced speed. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I saw the locket 2 days ago," Daniel yelled back, the confession ripped from him by the adrenaline. "Martha Blackstone was showing it off at the church social. She said it was a new gift from her husband." The truth hit Madeline like a physical blow. It was real, all of it. Finch's voice boomed across the platform. "Give her up, Clay. There's no way out of this for you." Daniel knew he was right. He had just thrown his entire life away. His badge, his honor, his future. For what? The word of a stranger? The memory of a woman he'd never met? But as he looked at Madeline, her face grim and determined as she fired back at the agents, he felt a strange sense of clarity. His old life had been safe. It had been honorable. But it had been empty. This was madness. It was suicide. But for the first time in years, he felt alive. "There's a back way out of town," he said, grabbing her arm. "Through the livery. My horse is there." They broke cover, running low and fast, the Pinkertons' bullets kicking up dust at their heels. They burst into the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and manure. Daniel's horse, a sturdy buckskin named Ghost, whinnied nervously in its stall. "They'll have the road blocked," Madeline said, her mind already working, calculating the odds. "We're not taking the road," Daniel said, throwing a saddle onto Ghost's back. "We're heading into the Badlands. They won't follow us there. Not at night." It was a desperate plan. The Badlands were a maze of canyons and cliffs, a place where a man could get lost and never be found. But it was their only chance. As he cinched the saddle, the stable doors burst open. It was Agent Finch, his face a mask of cold rage, pistol leveled. "It's over, Clay," Finch snarled. But he wasn't alone. Standing just behind him, partially shielded by the agent, was Daniel's own deputy. A young, eager kid named Billy. "Billy, get out of here!" Daniel yelled. Finch laughed. "Your deputy is a smart boy, Sheriff. He knows which side the law is on." But Billy didn't look smart. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide and his face was pale. He wasn't looking at Daniel. He was looking at Finch. In that split second, Daniel understood. Billy wasn't on Finch's side. He was a hostage. Before Daniel or Madeline could react, Finch fired, but he didn't shoot at them. He shot the deputy. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Billy crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Madeline screamed. "Now they'll say you killed your own deputy while resisting arrest," Finch said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You see, Clay, there's no way back for you now." The betrayal was so cold, so absolute, it stole the breath from Daniel's lungs. Finch wasn't a lawman. He was a monster, hiding behind a badge. He wasn't just here to capture Madeline. He was here to bury a secret. a secret so deep that it was worth killing federal agents, sheriffs, and deputies to protect. Rage, pure and undiluted, washed over Daniel. This was no longer about justice for Sarah. It was about survival. He kicked over a lantern. Flames erupted, catching instantly on the dry hay. The fire roared to life, a wall of orange and black separating them from Finch. The agent cursed and stumbled back, shielding his face from the intense heat. "Get on!" Daniel yelled, vaulting onto Ghost's back and pulling Madeline up behind him. He spurred the horse hard, sending it crashing through the stable's weak back wall. They burst out into the alley, splinters of wood flying around them, and galloped into the fading light, the smoke and screams of redemption fading behind them. They were fugitives now. A disgraced sheriff and a vengeful outlaw, riding into the unforgiving wilderness with the devil on their heels. And Daniel knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was about more than a stolen locket. It was about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, and they had just stumbled right into the heart of it. The Badlands were a nightmare of shadows and stone. Ghost scrambled over rocks and through narrow canyons, the darkness a welcome cloak. Behind them, the glow of the burning livery was a hateful orange smear against the night sky. Daniel rode with a grim determination. The image of his murdered deputy burned into his mind. He was a sheriff who had killed his own town. They rode for hours, pushing the horse to its limit, until the moon was high and the sounds of pursuit had long since faded. Finally, Daniel found what he was looking for. A small, hidden cave, tucked away behind a waterfall that trickled down a rock face. It was a place he'd found years ago, a shelter from the harsh world. He helped Madeline down from the horse. Her body was tense, but she moved with a weary grace. Inside the cave, the air was cool and damp. Daniel used his flint and steel to start a small, smokeless fire. In the flickering light, he could see the exhaustion etched on her face. The legendary outlaw looked frighteningly human. "They'll brand you a traitor," she said, her voice soft, all the fire gone from it. "A killer." "Finch killed Billy," Daniel said, his voice flat and hard. "He did it to frame us, to make sure no one would ever listen to our story." What is he protecting? She wondered aloud, staring into the flames. What is so important that he'd murder a federal agent and a deputy in broad daylight? Daniel thought of Judge Blackstone. His wealth had always seemed out of place, too vast for a simple mercantile owner and circuit judge. His power was absolute. He had the town council in his pocket, and now, it seemed, he had Pinkertons on his payroll. "Your sister," Daniel said, turning to Madeline. "In her letters, she never mentioned what she did before she decided to come here." Madeline shook her head. "She was a cartographer, a map maker. She worked for the territorial government, surveying land for new railway lines." The pieces began to click into place, forming a dark and terrifying picture. Land, railways, Blackstone, Finch. "The new line, it's supposed to bypass Redemption by 20 miles, Daniel said, more to himself than to her. Blackstone fought it, lobbied against it, said it would kill the town. What if he wasn't trying to save the town? Madeline whispered, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. What if he was trying to control the route for himself? She scrambled through the leather satchel she'd recovered from the platform, the one that had belonged to her sister. She pulled out a bundle of papers. They weren't letters, they were maps, detailed survey maps of the entire region. And on one of them, a section of land just north of Redemption was circled in red ink. Land that, according to the official records, was barren and worthless. But scrawled in the margin, in Sarah's neat handwriting, were 2 words: Silver Lode. It wasn't just about the railway. It was about what lay beneath it. Blackstone hadn't just stumbled upon some silver. Sarah's map suggested a massive, undiscovered vein. A mother lode. Enough to make a man richer than a king. Enough to buy judges, senators, and armies of Pinkerton agents. "He didn't just kill her for a locket," Daniel said, the full scope of the conspiracy settling on him like a physical weight. He killed her for this map. He tortured her for it. The thought was so vile it made him sick. The gentle woman from the letters, a victim of such brutal greed. Finch wasn't sent to arrest me for murdering a federal official, Madeline said, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of grief and rage. He was sent to retrieve this map and silence the last person who knew it existed. Now they understood. They weren't just fugitives. They were the keepers of a secret that could bring down the most powerful man in the territory. And that made them the most hunted people in the West. As dawn broke, casting long purple shadows across the canyons, Daniel knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Finch would be scouring the territory for them. Blackstone would be sealing off any escape routes. "We need proof," Daniel said, his mind racing. The map is her word against his. We need something more. Something that ties Blackstone directly to the murder. "The locket," Madeline said. "If we can get the locket from his wife, it proves he was at the stagecoach robbery." "Getting into Redemption is impossible," Daniel countered. "The town will be on lockdown. Finch will have men on every rooftop." "Then we don't go into town," Madeline said, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "We make them come to us." She pointed to a spot on the map. A narrow, treacherous canyon known as Devil's Jaw. "The stagecoach route, the one my sister was on. It passes through here. It's the only way to get supplies to Blackstone's private mining operation without going through town." "An ambush," Daniel said, understanding her plan. "He'll have the map," Madeline said. "He must have taken a copy from Sarah before he killed her. If we can get that copy, and the locket, we'll have him." It was a reckless, desperate gamble. They were two people against a private army, but it was their only play. They spent the day preparing. Daniel cleaned their weapons, his movements methodical and sure. Madeline studied the map, her mind sharp and strategic. A strange partnership was forming between them, forged in grief and fire. He was the lawman, used to rules and order. She was the outlaw, used to chaos and survival. Together, they were something new, something dangerous. As they set out for Devil's Jaw under the cover of dusk, a thought struck Daniel. A cold, unsettling thought that he had pushed aside in the chaos. "Madeline," he said, his voice low, "your wanted poster, the robberies, the bodies, was any of it true?" She was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable in the twilight. "Some of it," she finally admitted, her voice devoid of emotion. "After my family was killed and our ranch was stolen by men like Blackstone, I did what I had to do to survive. I took from them what they had taken from me. But I never hurt an innocent person. The bodies, those are lies. Lies spread by the men I robbed to make me a monster. To make sure no one would ever listen to me." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Does that change anything?" Daniel thought of the man he used to be. The sheriff who saw the world in black and white, in good guys and bad guys. That man would have been horrified. But that man was gone, burned away in the fire of the livery stable. "No," he said, and he meant it. "It doesn't change a thing." They reached the canyon and set their trap. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had the element of surprise, and they had a righteous fury that burned hotter than any sun. As they waited in the shadows, listening for the telltale rumble of the wagon, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost everything, his job, his home, his honor. But in the company of this fierce, broken woman, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A purpose. The wagon appeared, a dark shape in the moonlight, flanked by a dozen armed riders. And leading them, sitting in the driver's seat, was not some hired gun. It was Judge Harold Blackstone himself. And beside him, his face illuminated by a lantern, was Agent Elias Finch. They hadn't just sent men. They had come themselves. They had come to personally oversee the beginning of their empire. And Daniel and Madeline were waiting to tear it all down. The ambush was brutal and swift. They used dynamite, a trick Madeline had learned from her outlaw days, to block the canyon pass, trapping the wagon and its guards. In the ensuing chaos, Daniel and Madeline opened fire from the cliffs above. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. The guards, caught completely by surprise, fell one by one. Blackstone screamed in terror, a pathetic, high-pitched sound that was nothing like his booming, authoritative voice in the courtroom. Finch, however, was a different animal. He was a predator. He immediately took cover, returning fire with deadly accuracy. He and Daniel were locked in a duel, bullets ricocheting off the canyon walls as they fought for control. Madeline used the distraction to her advantage. She slipped down from the cliffs like a ghost, silent and deadly, circling around their flank. She dispatched the remaining guards with cold, efficient shots. Finally, it was just the four of them left. Daniel pinned down behind a rock, trading shots with Finch. And Blackstone, now weeping, trying to crawl under the wagon. Madeline appeared behind the judge, the barrel of her Colt pressing against his temple. "It's over, Harold," she hissed. Blackstone froze, whimpering. "Take the silver, take it all. Just let me live." "Where is the locket?" Madeline demanded. Trembling, Blackstone fumbled inside his coat and produced the small silver locket. He threw it on the ground. Madeline scooped it up, her eyes burning with tears. Justice for Sarah. "The map!" Daniel yelled from his position. "Get the map!" "I don't have it!" Blackstone shrieked. "Finch has it! It's in his saddlebag!" The moment Blackstone spoke, Finch made his move. He knew the fight was lost. He bolted from his cover, not toward Blackstone, but toward his horse. He was abandoning the judge, trying to save the one thing that still mattered, the proof of their claim. Daniel saw his chance. He broke cover, sprinting after Finch, firing as he ran. A bullet tore through Daniel's shoulder, a searing white-hot pain, but he didn't stop. He tackled Finch just as the agent reached his horse, sending them both tumbling into the dust. They wrestled for Finch's gun, a desperate, grunting struggle for survival. Finch was strong, wiry, but Daniel was fueled by a righteous fury. He slammed the agent's head against a rock, once, twice. Finch went limp. It was over. Daniel stumbled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, his body screaming in protest. Madeline had Blackstone secured, his hands tied. The great, powerful judge looked small and pathetic, stripped of his authority. "We did it," Madeline breathed, her voice filled with a stunned disbelief. "It's done." But as Daniel looked at the captured agent and the sniveling judge, he knew it wasn't that simple. They were in the middle of nowhere, with a wounded shoulder and two high-value prisoners. They had the proof, yes. But who could they take it to? Who could they trust? Blackstone's corruption ran deep. The nearest town was Redemption, where Daniel was now wanted for murder and arson. The nearest real authority was in the territorial capital, 100 miles away. And then, another sound reached them. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast. It wasn't a small posse. It sounded like a cavalry troop. Finch, groaning as he regained consciousness, started to laugh. A weak, gurgling sound. "You think this is over?" he rasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think Blackstone is the top of the chain? He's nothing, a pawn." A terrible realization dawned on Daniel. They hadn't won. They had just kicked the hornet's nest. "Who?" Daniel demanded, pressing his boot against Finch's chest. "Who are you working for?" "The man who owns this territory," Finch choked out with a bloody smile. "The man who's going to hang you both from the highest tree he can find. The railroad is coming, Sheriff, and it always gets what it wants." The riders appeared over the canyon rim. They weren't soldiers. They were grim-faced men in dusty coats, all armed with brand-new Winchester rifles. They moved with the cold efficiency of professional killers. And at their head rode a man in a fine suit, his face impassive, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He looked completely out of place in the rugged canyon, yet he commanded the scene with an absolute, terrifying authority. Daniel had seen him once before, at a territorial dinner. It was Silas Blackwood, the railroad baron, the man who was single-handedly dragging the West into the modern age, whether it wanted to go or not. The richest, most powerful, and most ruthless man in Arizona. Blackwood surveyed the scene, the dead guards, the destroyed wagon, the captured judge. His expression didn't change. He looked at Daniel and Madeline as if they were insects. "Sheriff Clay," Blackwood said, his voice calm and cultured, "and the infamous Madeline Kane, you have caused me a considerable inconvenience." He dismounted, walking over to the whimpering Judge Blackstone. "Harold, you have been a profound disappointment." Without another word, Blackwood drew a small, elegant pistol from his coat and shot the judge in the head. Madeline gasped in horror. Blackwood turned his cold gaze back to them. "Loose ends," he said simply, as if discussing a matter of business. He looked at Finch, who was being helped to his feet by two of the gunmen. "Elias, your performance has also been lacking, but you may yet redeem yourself." He gestured toward Daniel and Madeline. "Kill them, get the map, and burn the bodies. I want this entire incident erased from history." With that, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, as if the matter was already settled. He didn't even look back. Finch, holding a bloody handkerchief to his head, grinned maliciously at Daniel. "Like I said, Sheriff, the railroad always gets what it wants." They were surrounded, outnumbered 20-1. Daniel's shoulder was on fire, and they had only a few rounds of ammunition left. There was no escape, no hope. This was the end of the line. They had fought for justice, only to find a monster far greater than the one they had slain. As Blackwood's men raised their rifles, Daniel looked at Madeline. Her face was pale but defiant. Her eyes met his, and in that final moment, he saw no fear. He saw the same fire he had seen on the train platform, the same unbreakable spirit. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm. "My sister would have liked you," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the clicking of 24 rifle hammers. Daniel squeezed her hand. "I already feel like I knew her," he replied. They had lost, but they were together. And as the rifles leveled, a new sound echoed through the canyon, a sound that didn't belong, a war cry. It came from the cliffs above, from all around them. Suddenly, the canyon rim was lined with figures. Dozens of them. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted for battle, armed with bows and rifles. And at their lead was a young warrior Daniel recognized. He was the son of the local chief, a man named Geronimo. Daniel had treated him with respect in the past, unlike most of the other white men in the territory. He had honored their treaties. A small act of decency he had never thought would matter. Silas Blackwood's men, so confident just a moment before, now looked up in terror. They were caught in a trap of their own. The first arrow flew, silent and deadly, striking one of the gunmen in the throat. He fell without a sound, and then the sky rained death. The battle was a whirlwind of confusion and violence. The Apache were masters of their terrain, moving like ghosts among the rocks, picking off Blackwood's men with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Finch, realizing the tables had turned, tried to make a run for it, but Madeline was faster. She fired her last bullet, the shot echoing through the canyon. It struck Finch in the leg, sending him sprawling. She was on him in a second, her knife at his throat. "This is for my sister," she whispered, and a moment later, it was done. When the dust settled, the canyon was silent once more. Blackwood's private army had been wiped out. The Apache warriors gathered the rifles and ammunition from the dead, their faces grim. The young chief approached Daniel and Madeline. He looked at Daniel's wounded shoulder, then at the bodies of the gunmen. "This is our land," he said in perfect English. "The railroad man, Blackwood. He tried to steal it. Your maps." He nodded toward Sarah's satchel. "Proved it. We have been watching, waiting." He looked from Daniel to Madeline, his gaze lingering on their joined hands. "You fight for the land. You fight for the memory of the dead. You have honor. My father would like to speak with you." They were led to the Apache village, a place few white men had ever seen. There they were treated not as prisoners, but as guests. Daniel's wound was tended to by the tribe's shaman. As he recovered, he and Madeline told their story to the chief. They showed him the maps, the locket, the proof of Blackwood's vast and murderous conspiracy. The chief listened, his ancient face a mask of wisdom. When they were finished, he spoke. "The white man's law has failed you, so you will have Apache justice." He explained that Blackwood's power came from his railroad, and the railroad was vulnerable. It was a long, thin snake stretching across the territory, a snake that could be cut. Over the next few weeks, an unlikely alliance was formed. An ex-sheriff, an outlaw, and a tribe of Apache warriors, all united against a common enemy. They were no longer just fighting for revenge. They were fighting for their very way of life, against the crushing, soulless greed of men like Blackwood. Using Sarah's maps and the Apache's intimate knowledge of the land, they began a campaign of sabotage. They didn't hit trains or hurt people. They hit the infrastructure. They dismantled sections of track in remote locations. They destroyed trestle bridges over deep ravines. They diverted water sources needed for the steam engines. They were ghosts. They struck in the night and vanished into the wilderness. The railroad, Blackwood's symbol of invincible progress, began to grind to a halt. The costs of repairs and delays mounted, bleeding him dry. His investors grew nervous. His political allies began to distance themselves. Blackwood grew more and more desperate. He put a massive bounty on their heads, 10 times what Madeline's had been. He sent hundreds of men into the Badlands to hunt them. But his men were city dwellers and hired thugs. In the wilderness, against the Apache, they were children. They found nothing but frustration and fear. During this time, living and fighting side by side, Daniel and Madeline grew closer. The harsh lines on her face began to soften. He saw the woman she could have been, the woman Sarah had been. And she saw in him a man of quiet strength and unwavering honor, a man who had sacrificed everything for what was right. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. One evening, as they sat by a fire watching the stars, she finally turned to him. "When this is over," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "what will you do?" "I can't go back," he said. "The man I was is gone." "Good," she replied, a faint smile on her lips. "I never much cared for sheriffs." He looked at her, at the woman who had crashed into his life and shattered it, only to rebuild it into something stronger and more true. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For the first time in my life, I'm not following a map." "Maybe," she said, her hand finding his in the dark. "We can draw a new one, together." The final confrontation came not in a hail of bullets, but in a whisper of ink. Daniel, using his knowledge of the law, helped the Apache chief draft a legal document. It combined Sarah's original survey maps with ancient tribal treaties and a detailed account of Blackwood's crimes, witnessed and signed by the entire tribal council. It was a declaration of sovereignty and a demand for justice, backed by the undeniable truth of the land itself. They sent it not to the corrupt territorial government, but to a journalist in Washington, D.C., a man known for his crusades against corporate corruption. The story exploded. Published on the front page of the Washington Chronicle, it was a national scandal. Railroad barons' empire of blood and lies in Arizona. The articles detailed the stolen land, the murder of Sarah Kane, the framing of a sheriff, and the war against the Apache. Faced with public outcry and a congressional investigation, Blackwood's empire crumbled in a matter of weeks. His allies abandoned him. His investors pulled out. He was ruined. The last Daniel and Madeline heard, Silas Blackwood had taken his own life in his opulent San Francisco mansion, a coward's end for a man who had caused so much death. The federal government, shamed into action, officially recognized the Apaches' land rights as laid out in Sarah's maps. The silver lode belonged to them, ensuring their prosperity for generations. Daniel and Madeline were officially pardoned, their names cleared. They stood on a hill overlooking the vast, beautiful landscape, the same land they had fought for. The silence of the desert was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. "It's over," Daniel said. "We won." Madeline slipped her arm through his, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Sarah won," she corrected him gently. "Her maps, her truth." In the end, her voice was louder than all their guns. They turned away from the setting sun and walked toward a new horizon. They didn't know where they were going. They had no plan, no home, no titles. All they had was each other. They were no longer a sheriff and an outlaw. They were just two people who had found each other in the fire, two survivors who had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful futures are the ones that are unwritten. A new beginning, born from the ashes of the old. The story of the ghost sheriff and the vulture queen became a legend in the territory, a whisper around campfires, a tale of how a mail-order bride who never arrived managed to save a people, take down a tyrant, and give two lost souls a second chance at life. A reminder that even in the most lawless of places, justice can find a way. If you enjoyed this story of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a story that I think you'll find to be interesting, then you should be sure to like and subscribe, because we post videos like this all the time.